Good afternoon, everyone. This is Corey from the National Weather Service. We appreciate everybody taking the time out of your day today to come join us for this webinar. Typically, as you probably all well know, we do a winter kind of webinar, talking about the winter season and what to expect. We've also started to do a spring one fairly frequently as well. And after kind of looking at the outlooks and some of the expectations and talking with Megan and Alan and Amanda here, who's all on the webinar today and you might hear from, we thought it would be good to get everybody together and talk a little bit about what we're thinking for summer as well. So that's what we're going to go ahead and talk about here today, is talk a little bit about what's happened so far and then what some of the things are that we're looking at into the summer in regards to just kind of the outlooks and drought expectations, and what that might mean for the fire weather expectations and season that we're kind of having out there already now. Just as a reminder, we're going to keep everybody's phones muted, and if at the end, there will be an opportunity at the end for you to ask questions. And so if you decide that you want to do that, you can go ahead and raise your hand and we'll unmute you, but you might have to unmute yourself as well. But probably the better route might be to use the questions box. There's a questions box. You can just go ahead and put your question in that. And that way we can just kind of read the question off and answer it for everybody. But whichever way, we'll definitely have time for that. Also, if you don't want to ask anything on the webinar here today online, you can always get a hold of us afterwards. You got the number there for the Bismarck office and the Grand Forks office. Also the contact information for Megan, Alan, and Amanda, who you're going to hear from here today. Also, Tyler is also one of the folks over there that does a lot with some of the outlooks and those types of things. So he might be a resource for you as well. So with that, I think I'm going to pass it over to Megan here and let her talk about kind of what we've seen so far and some of the expectations going forward.
Thanks so much, Corey. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Like Corey said, we've been doing these for the winter and a midwinter update, but this is the first time, at least any of us remember, that we are doing an Outlook webinar specifically for spring and summer. So hopefully we can provide some helpful information for you for your planning for the next couple of months. To start, I figured it could be useful to look at what has been going on for the past winter, what we thought going into the winter season and how things ended up. This is the outlook. If you were on our winter outlook webinar, this is what we talked about back in October. The seasonal temperature outlook is on the left and the precipitation outlook is on the right. We were expecting below normal temperatures for meteorological winter, which is December, January, February. And then there wasn't a strong signal in precipitation chances, which meant that there were equal chances for above, below, or near normal temperatures, just because there wasn't a strong signal either way. So how things have been going, this is the temperatures. On the left is the departure from normal temperature for just meteorological winter, so that's what that outlook was valid for. And then on the right is the departure from normal temperature for the entire cold season, as we call it sometimes, starting on October 1st and going until yesterday, just because up here in North Dakota, most of the time, winter is lasting a lot longer than the typical 3 months of meteorological winter. On the right, so for December, January, February, things actually ended up relatively close to what we were thinking. We had below normal temperatures across most of the state, except for some areas in eastern North Dakota. That's that yellow shading. But otherwise, the majority of the state was kind of in this light to regular green shading, which is -2 to -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Some areas in the north central, especially where they had a bit more prevalent of a snowpack, were a little bit colder than that. By the time you look on the right to the temperature anomalies for October through yesterday, little weaker of a cold signal. We were pretty warm in the fall, and then we've also been quite mild in March, so we're really starting to cancel out some of that cold signal that we saw for the winter. But overall, for the winter season, that cold outlook did verify pretty well for the state of North Dakota. Precipitation is not going the way that we hoped, unfortunately. So on the left is the percent of normal precipitation for meteorological winter. Again, that's December, January, February. On the right is the percent of normal precipitation for that entire cold season period that we talked about. This is also the start of the water year, October 1st through yesterday. So for meteorological winter on the left, a couple areas managed to get some normal to maybe even above normal precipitation. A couple spots out west, the northeast part of the state. By the time you go to that full period since the start of the water year on the right, unfortunately, the only area that's really doing well is the northeast corner of the state, and kind of this, the yellow is 90 to 100% of normal, the green is 100 to 120% of normal. So they're doing pretty okay. The rest of the state, especially parts of the west and central where you've got kind of this dark maroon color, which is 25 to 50% of normal, we've definitely been in a precipitation deficit for a while now. And I'll leave a lot of the drought talk to Alan in a little bit, but we have just not gotten the precipitation that we were hoping for and also expecting with the pattern that we've been seeing. For the season total snow, unfortunately, we don't have the anomaly map that we normally show. That wasn't able to get updated today, but this is the season total snow so far. This light yellow is 12 to 24 inches. This kind of gold color is 24 to 36. And then you see there's some pockets up in northern North Dakota of 36 to 48 inches. For anomalies, the northern part of the state is closest to normal, generally 0 to 10 inches below normal. By the time you go farther south in the state, the anomalies do start to increase. So Grand Forks is about 15 inches below normal seasonal snowfall as of today. And then by the time you get down to Bismarck and Fargo and kind of that I-94 corridor, anywhere from 20 to 30 inches below normal snowfall. So again, not only has it just been dry in general, but we also have not been seeing that snowfall. We really have had no snowpack for a while now, as I'm sure all of you have noticed. So certainly a pretty significant deficit for this point in the winter season. We do have the La Nina advisory still in effect, as we've talked about on the previous Outlook webinars. That was the big factor for this winter. It has been a short duration and weak event. So we did see the cold anomaly that we were expecting with this, but you know, we are expecting the transition to ENSO neutral during this spring season. So the effects can be a little bit lagged with La Nina, but we are expecting that to kind of fade over the next month or two. We looked at these at the last webinar because I think it's really important to look at not only the seasonal outlooks and seasonal trends, but also month to month, because I think we can see pretty significant differences for different months in a specific season. So these are monthly temperature anomalies based on past weak La Nina events. This is valid for March over here on the left, April in the middle, and then May on the right. I will start out by saying, obviously, this is not going the way that you would think based on the historical data. Looking at March on the left, we are favored to be colder than normal just based on what we've seen for past similar events. That is not happening. I think Bismarck right now is running about 7 degrees above average, so certainly not meeting the expectation there. When we look at April in the middle frame, there is still a little bit of a cold anomaly. It's not as strong and it's not as widespread as the March signal, but there is still some cold signal there for April. By the time we get to May, that composite that we're seeing is widespread warmth across the central part of the country. So as it might be a little bit variable in the rest in March and April, which I think we've also seen, is that temperatures have been pretty up and down, even though they've averaged out to be above normal across the state. You know, we might start seeing a little bit more consistent warmth as we go into the end of the meteorological spring season, which is May. Similar, this is the monthly precipitation anomalies for weak La Nina events, March on the left, April in the middle, and May on the right. Again, for March, there was not a strong signal looking at historical data. It has been very dry across the state, so that not really matching there, but we also weren't quite sure which way it would go. April, we talked about this a couple months ago, there is still this signal in historical data for a little bit of a wet signal. It has been getting at least somewhat more active recently. I know that there hasn't been any big precipitation events, no big Colorado lows to bring lots of precipitation to the area, but we've gotten little shots here and there, and we're even looking at some more precipitation chances this weekend. So there's something to be said there, but not a lot of confidence in that signal. By the time we look at May over here on the left, you start to see that dry signal, especially across central and eastern parts of the state into Minnesota. That becomes a little more obvious when looking at historical data for these events. So we took a similar approach when we're looking at the summer, but it is some different years. So looking at weak La Nina years transitioning to that ENSO neutral-ish sort of phase, which is not all the same years as the previous slides. Some of the weak La Nina events, looking back at historical events, transitioned very quickly to an El Nino event, which is not what we're expecting right now. So we didn't think that would be a really fair comparison to include. So not quite the same years. Some of the analog years that have been showing up in forecasters' discussions and some other products that we've been looking at, might stand out to some of you. I know we were talking about that locally, Alan and myself especially. 1960s come up a lot, 1996, 2017, and 2021, which I know those are 2 years that are certainly going to get your attention if you've been around the state for a little bit in terms of drought conditions. But I know 1996 stood out to us, and I'm going to pick on Alan for a little bit and have him explain why that year stood out to him.
Yeah, that's right, Megan. So 1996, for those of you that have been around North Dakota long enough to remember, the winter of 96-97 was one of the most brutal winters the state had ever seen. That led to the spring flooding of the Red River Valley, and in particular, Fargo and Grand Forks suffered very damaging floods in the spring of 1997. And again, if you were in North Dakota in 1996, the winter of 96-97 really stands out. A lot of the places across the state set new record snowfall temperature or snowfall amounts for that year. There were a number of deaths attributed to the blizzards that winter. In 1996, I was a graduate student up at UND in Grand Forks, and I remember specifically there were a couple of college students that died due to weather events. And kind of humorously, the local news media were naming the blizzards back then. It was kind of the start of the naming of blizzards. And by the time we got around the middle of January, the public was clamoring for them to stop naming blizzards because it was giving people the false impression that we were cold up here. So again, I think one of the key things here, the take home from this, is that the current conditions are what they are. Our expectations going forward are what they are based on statistics and everything. But oftentimes we don't see that inflection point where there's a rapid change, especially if it's 3-4 months out. We don't recognize it always that far out. We don't see it until it's in our near-term forecast for a while. So that's kind of why I really wanted to pick on that 1996 year. So.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, as he said, 1996 was a dry summer. We looked at the data, but then there was a really rapid switch to definitely not drought conditions anymore, which I think is what we always want to emphasize, is that things up here, I have learned, can switch very quickly. So we are giving the outlook with what we currently have and the tools we currently have, but that doesn't mean that further down the line later in the year, there could be a pretty prominent switch to something else. So looking at these temperature anomalies, again, June on the left, July in the middle, and August on the right. For June, it's interesting that there's really not too strong of a signal across the state from comparing it to past historical events. A little warm signal in Montana, a little cool signal in the southeast part of the state, but nothing too major. By the time we get to July, you're starting to see that warm signal show up a little bit more, but again, not a very strong anomaly. And the same thing in August, a little more widespread across the state, but not too strong of a warm anomaly. So that is something that kind of stood out as a little warm anomaly, but nothing super strong compared to what it looks like we're seeing in the precipitation data, which is on this slide. So again, the same years, same method of picking years that go from that weak La Nina to kind of an ENSO neutral. June on the left, July in the middle, August on the right. June, you do start to see that dry signal show up, especially across northern and eastern parts of the state. It becomes a little more widespread in July across not only North Dakota, but kind of that northern plains region before it really starts to disappear in August, which I thought was also interesting. So you're not getting too much overlap between the really warm and the really dry. That shows up most in July, but again, it's not a really widespread across all 3 months. Definitely some signals month to month to pick up on there. I also like looking at the risk of extremes. I think it paints the picture really well of what we're dealing with during La Nina and kind of that transition in the summer. So on the left is the March, April, May temperature during La Nina. It's an increased risk of warm or cold extremes. You can see across North Dakota and the northern plains, there's an increased risk of cold extremes, which fits with what we typically expect, that cold we see during La Nina winters hangs on into the spring season. And then on the right is the precipitation, increased risk of wet or dry extremes. And there's not much there for North Dakota, which is also not super surprising based on what we've talked about. What we typically see is that La Nina itself is not driving too much a lot of the year in terms of precipitation, much more confidence in the temperatures, which is what we ended up seeing this winter. This isn't quite a one-to-one comparison. These are the same plots, but for June, July, August. I don't think we're going to be in La Nina conditions. We'll probably be in the cool phase of ENSO neutral. So not a full comparison, but I did think it was interesting to note that you do lose that temperature risk of extremes either way. Little signal in South Dakota, but nothing in North Dakota. But then on the right, this is the precipitation risk. And you really start to see that dry extreme come out, which is unfortunately fitting quite well with what we're seeing in historical data and what we're seeing in the outlooks, which is where we will go here next. The weeks 3 to 4 outlook as we go through the spring is a little iffy. It's been a little bit tricky of a forecast just because things have been so up and down. These outlooks for weeks 3 to 4 do update every Friday afternoon, once a week. These right now are valid for April 5th through 18th. So this is like the bulk of the month of April. You can see North Dakota slightly favored for above normal temperatures, not a very strong signal compared to what we can see, especially what you're seeing in other parts of the US. It is interesting that there is a bit of a precipitation signal, especially across the eastern part of the state into Minnesota. So again, what the historical data shows sometimes is that there is a little bit more of an active period that develops late in these La Nina winters, which we've started to see a little bit, but again, nothing too significant, but it is worth watching, especially as we go into April for some parts of the state. For the full April outlook, they noted in the discussion, and if you've never read the discussions from these forecasters, they can be really insightful. For April, there was a lot of difficulty just because they have some conflicting signals going on. We're in that transition period in the spring in general, where it can just be, again, what we've seen, really up and down, really variable temperatures that make it hard to predict if things are going to end up one way or the other. Also for precipitation on the right, again, equal chances for above, below, or near normal. So not, we'd like to see a little bit more favored for above normal precipitation to help us out, but no dry signal just yet. It is worth noting that average high temperatures go from around 50 degrees at the start of the month to the lower 60s by the end of the month. So even if it's below normal, it ends up below normal. That doesn't mean cold, that just means a little bit cooler for this season. I also wanted to show this. This is why one of the reasons they had trouble with this temperature outlook. These are the average temperature trends on the right for April specifically. There is a little bit of a cooling trend. I think a lot of people who have lived here for a while have made comments about spring cooling and winter just seems to hang on a little bit longer in the spring than it used to, and that does show up in the data. So again, battling the temperature trends over the last 30 years or so versus what's been going on, especially with soil moisture and things, can be kind of tough to predict the month as a whole. We're going to step through the seasonal outlooks now. If you've never seen these, they're valid for 3 months. This one is for April, May, June. On the left is the seasonal temperature outlook, and on the right is the precipitation outlook. So we'll go through the next seasons all the way through the fall season. For April, May, June, as we talked about, April's a little bit iffy in terms of confidence in what's going to happen. May is a similar way based on the forecaster's notes. So we do have equal chances for temperature and precipitation, so not too much to go off of there. By the time we get to May, June, July, still equal chances for temperature, as they're not quite sure how quickly things are going to warm up with the late spring and early summer period. We do start to get into this slight tilt towards below normal precipitation. So this tan color is correlated to 33 to 40% below normal, so not super strong signal, but that is starting to show up in this season. By the time we get to the official, if you could call it, summer outlook for June, July, August, meteorological summer, we do have the tilt towards above normal temperatures. Again, not a strong tilt, but it is there for the entire state and the entire region. And on the right, you'll notice that the precipitation outlook does not look great. We'll be honest. This is not great for us to be looking at a couple months in advance. This is in terms of the outlooks and what we typically see, this is a relatively strong signal for below normal precipitation. Percentage-wise, it's not that strong, but for the forecasters to paint such a large area for below normal precipitation at this lead time is certainly concerning. And so that was one of the reasons behind this webinar. Is we wanted to start advertising what we were seeing so that people could start preparing that things might be trending even drier for the summer. I did want to note, I always like looking at these pie charts to kind of emphasize that this is a tilt. It's never a guarantee. This precipitation pie chart, especially over here on the right, there is a 47% chance of below normal precipitation for the season. There's still a 33% chance that precipitation ends up near normal, and even a 20% chance of above normal. So it's never a guarantee. Especially summer can just be really tricky. You think about thunderstorms and the heavy rain that they can bring. So we're not saying that everywhere is going to have below normal precipitation, but for the state and across the season as a whole, this is what's favored right now. We step ahead to July, August, September. It looks very similar, still favored for above normal temperatures, still favored across the region for below normal precipitation. 1 month further, August, September, October, we do start to lose that temperature signal a little bit, but we do still have the signal for below normal precipitation across kind of the greater Dakotas area. Before we go to the fall outlook, September, October, November, equal chances again in temperature. And then we still have the below normal lean, although it does decrease in probability a little bit as that signal starts to fade as we exit the summer and go into the fall season. These outlooks, like I said, there is a text discussion online that you can read that's associated with these outlooks. It can be really insightful. Some of the things that these outlooks are based off of, one is the very consistent and strong signal for below normal precipitation from all sorts of long-range model guidance that the forecasters use. I went and looked at it myself, and sometimes it can be very conflicting depending on the model that you're looking at. Unfortunately, in this case, everything is advertising a very similar scenario of the below normal precipitation. There's also been a trend towards lower precipitation in the last 15 years or so, a trend towards warmer temperatures, especially later on in the year. That uncertainty in April and May is why we see the equal chances in those first few seasonal outlooks. And then, of course, it is already pretty dry out there. That was one of the factors in the outlooks. As everyone always likes to say, drought begets drought. And since we already have drought conditions, as Alan will talk about, that unfortunately makes it easier for drought conditions to continue. I also wanted to touch on this really quickly, thinking about trends for the past 30 years, especially in the summer. The average temperature trend is on the left and precipitation trends is on the right. You can see the warm signal across all of North Dakota. It's not a very strong warm signal, but it is there, so that factored into the summer outlook. And the precipitation trends, this actually brought up some really interesting discussion between us and the Grand Forks office, because I think as you may have seen or we've talked about before, that there is definitely been a wet cycle recently that seemed to be really favored in the 90s and the 2000s before there actually has been a little bit of a decrease in precipitation amounts. So apparently that was enough to kind of skew at least these summer precipitation trends towards drier than normal. But again, that's not the annual trend, that's just for summer. That is strongest in July. There's actually a little bit of a wet signal in August, which we also saw when we were looking at past years with similar ENSO values. So that is something to note, that July may be favored to be the driest month of all of them, but maybe a little bit of a switch in August, looking at past trends and some historical data. As far as the ENSO forecast, right now we are in the spring predictability barrier, which means that there's relatively low confidence in this month's forecast, but these are the official probabilities in this graph. The gray bars are the probability for ENSO neutral conditions, which means it's not in one phase or the other. The blue bars are La Nina, which is what we are still technically in, but that is fading pretty quick. And then the red bars are the probability of an El Nino event. You can see as we go through the seasons at the bottom, JJA is that June, July, August summer season, again, still ENSO neutral favored. By the time we get to September, October, November, which is meteorological fall, and then October, November, December, you start to get equal probabilities for ENSO neutral and another La Nina, which this could be recency bias, but it does feel like we always get, it's never just one La Nina, we always end up with a second one. If we do return to La Nina conditions, which is what we'll be keeping an eye on over the next couple months, that would favor a milder fall, which I think we've seen the past couple years just in general. We get longer end to the growing season, could potentially have some fire weather implications. So again, those are things we'll be keeping an eye on. Finally, to summarize all of this, like we talked about, still some highly variable temperatures through much of the spring, as like what we've been seeing recently, before a transition to more consistently near to above normal temperatures late in the spring through the summer and into the fall. The temperature signal is not as strong, but I do want to note that if we do keep the drought conditions or even like expand the drought, which Alan will talk about, that would increase the probability of above normal temperatures. Those do go hand in hand. For precipitation, it would be great to get something in April. We're not really seeing anything too consistent, but it doesn't look dry. So we're hoping that we can at least get a little something to help us out before we go into the summer when that dry signal really starts to increase before eventually fading in the fall. Like I said, summer precipitation is really tricky. It can be dry across the entire state, the entire region, but some places can get that localized heavy rain from thunderstorms. So it's hard to categorize the entire state as a whole. But right now there is much more concern for drought versus, you know, what's left of spring and any flooding associated with that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our hydrologist, Alan, to talk about drought and the lack of flooding.
All right, thanks, Megan. So again, I'm Alan Schlag. I'm the hydrologist here in the Bismarck office, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what's left as far as the spring flood season, and then we'll quickly move into discussion on the drought and what our expectations are for that. So as I often tell people, when it comes to flooding, it really all starts with the soil moisture out there. If your soils are dry and they're warming up as they currently are across the state, they become very amenable to infiltrating excess rainfall or snow melt. And so here's a quick glimpse of soil moisture down to 100 centimeters or roughly 3 feet. And these are based as percentiles. So those really dark red colors you see on the map, we're below the second percentile. That means 98 years out of 100, we would expect there to be more moisture in the soil than there is currently. And so these maps are updated daily through Sportless. And we can see widely across western North Dakota and again down in the southeastern part of the state, we clearly have large areas of below the 5th percentile for soil moisture. And that is extremely important because this is the time of year where we oftentimes have what I call the spring reset. Okay, that's where we melt off our snowpack. A lot of water infiltrates into the ground. It replenishes soil moisture. Some of it makes it down to the aquifers. So those drinking water wells, they stay watered up. And that soil moisture is so critical to getting a good head start on our vegetation growing season as we move through the month of April and May when the soils really warm up. And then that excess soil moisture oftentimes is what makes or breaks those early season crops that are out there. Not only our native vegetation, but also the small grain crops. We get plenty of soil moisture at this time of year, those crops tend to do pretty well. Lack of soil moisture this time of year, those crops seem to struggle, as does the native vegetation. So right now it is pretty dire across the state with regard to soil moisture. I suspect we'll see a little bit of improvement on the eastern side of the state as they continue to see that snow that they had recently received infiltrate into the ground. I don't expect to see a lot of runoff from it, but I do expect these numbers to improve a little bit, especially on the eastern side of the North Dakota. So here's our current snow water equivalent I was just mentioning. You see over on the eastern third of the state, the results of that Colorado low that moved through the area a little while ago. And that's the snow that has yet to melt off, along with up along the northern tier counties in two places in particular. The Turtle Mountain area up northeast of Botno there, that has a fairly substantial snowpack yet that has not fully melted off. That drains into Willow Creek, and for western and central North Dakota, Willow Creek is really the only area that we have at least some chance of seeing minor flooding on a forecast point itself. Now, over in the eastern part of the state, up here, that's the Pembina River basin that you see in southern Canada, just north of Langdon up there. And that again also has a fair amount of snow remaining in the Pembina River watershed. Not going to talk too much about the risk of flooding up there, but there's certainly a fair amount of water that will still need to move through the system. Just how rapidly it does it will determine if there will be any chance for even minor flooding. The rest of this area down here, where we still see a little bit of snow, that volumetrically is not enough to be a concern. So when we get down into the Cheyenne River and the southern portion of the Red River Basin, really very nominal amounts of snow and water equivalent, especially on the ground. Not a lot of high expectations for concerns there. Actually, I think most of us would refer to that as very beneficial for this time of the year. So let's take a look a little bit farther west and go out into the mountainous area of Montana, that which contributes to the Yellowstone and to the Missouri rivers, which ends up here in North Dakota. Pretty important water supply feature and recreational feature going through middle of North Dakota. And early on in the year, it looked pretty dry, but here just recently, it's been trying really, really hard to get back up to near normal. So we're still about 3 weeks away in the historically normal snow accumulation period for the upper watershed of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers. That's when it usually peaks, is around the second week of April. So we still have a little bit of time to continue building moisture out there. But right now we're just below normal, maybe in the upper 90, 95, 98% of normal snowpack out there. So in short, the spring flood season, really only the Pembina and a portion of the Service River Basin contain an appreciable amount of snow water equivalent remaining. The dry and warming soils, I expect that to be a real strong influence on the amount of runoff that is generated, and then that is going to minimize runoff as the soils start to accept some of that moisture. And I think this is largely true across North Dakota in general, and that's going to be important if and when we start seeing our April showers, because again, we really would like to see a fair amount of rain in April in order to start replenishing that depleted soil moisture. So overall, the risk of widespread spring flood season is really well below normal at this point. Oftentimes we're still gearing up for a spring flood season as we get to this point in March and looking at April, and that's really just not a strong possibility this year. So let's look at drought concerns. Oddly enough, this drought map, while it has some nuances and stuff that are different from last year at this same time, the amount of drought in North Dakota is roughly equal to what we've seen in North Dakota going into last year's spring season. And most people will probably remember that not this current winter, but last year, there was almost no snow on the ground going into the spring traditional snow melt season. What really saved us were the April rains that came in. April and early May were very wet, and we saw a lot of the soil moisture values skyrocket, and then farmers did pretty well. And it wasn't until we got into the latter part of July that the spigot turned off. We stopped receiving regular rainfalls, and the crops and the native vegetation had to survive on the soil moisture and kind of a meager portioning of rainfall through the latter part of July and most of August until we had that really large rainstorm towards the end of August. So drought continues to plague much of western and southern North Dakota right now. Again, not unlike last year. And one of the things is that this map hasn't changed much over the course of the winter, and that's because of winter, when we're in the snow accumulation season, there just isn't much cause for being terribly concerned about a lack of snow until you get right into the spring melt season. You're like, well, we missed out on our chance for hitting the reset button. So we don't make a lot of changes to the drought map typically during the winter, but I would expect as we go into the coming weeks, and I mean like starting next week, maybe the week after, we're going to start seeing some significant changes on this map. And currently, if I had to guess, those changes are not going to look nice. They're going to put more color on the map and increase the coverage of drought across North Dakota. So like I said, right now, after Megan's discussion of what we're expecting to see this late spring going into summer. Those of us that like warm, sunshiny days are going to be very happy. Those of us that depend upon moisture to make a living, especially in the ag industry, maybe not nearly as happy. So that's where we stand with drought, and regrettably, the expectations are not rosy going forward. So kind of in a summary for hydrologic concerns, there's really no indication in the seasonal outlooks that we should expect widespread relief to the current drought conditions. At the same time, though, we always have to remember that while that statement is true, it is also true that we don't always see changes in the existing trends, really far into the future. Things tend to kind of sneak up on us, and all of a sudden we don't realize we are wetter than normal until we've had our second or third week in a row of decent rainfall. So that may again be the case this year. One thing I will say though right now is that small man-made water supply features, I'm talking about stock dams, those little things that we put in the countryside to help agriculture, especially ranchers, if they're not already full, I have very little expectations they will fill this year. Summertime rainfall usually does not create enough runoff to be a significant contributor to filling those small man-made water supply features. Okay. Now, with that, let's talk a little bit about fire concerns, in particular wildfires, those things that happen out in the countryside away from town and everything. All indications are right now an extended spring fire season is likely due to a lack of snow continues until green up. Okay, once the grass starts growing and we start getting that moisture in the grass above ground, we're going to be able to see the fuels out there dry very quickly. And a lot of that's going to be dictated by wind events. Okay, this time of year, temperature as we warm up and winds in particular, they will drive the fire weather maps and a lot of the burn restrictions out there. If or when a prolonged warm stretch develops, fuel moistures again will rapidly lower and increase fire behavior. One of the reasons for that is without a significant snowpack through the winter, a lot of our grasses that grew last year remain vertical. And so when we get that warm air, and especially when it comes with wind, they dry out really quickly, and that's how we get easy access for fires to start and become sometimes problematic. Persistent dry conditions in the summer or redevelopment of them after green up. So we're kind of talking about, the green up in April and May. So June, July, we could see these cool season grasses cure early. And that's not terribly unusual for North Dakota. It causes a lot of fireworks restrictions in July. So that is one thing to look out for, is that even once we get the green up, we get some grass growing, sure, there's just enough moisture out there, we will at least have a green up once the soil temperatures climb sufficiently, but it may be of short duration and put us into fire weather concerns earlier in summer than normal. Early grass curing could lead, like say, to earlier than average summer and fall fire season. Obviously, if the outlooks for the summer come to fruition and we're that warmer signal and drier than normal, it will certainly make problems in the countryside stand out just a little bit more. Fires will be a little easier to start, and once they do start, they may be a little more difficult to control. So I think with that, we'll go to questions.
I think also, if Amanda, if you want to unmute yourself, if you want to kind of cover anything for the eastern part of the state.
Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Great. I don't have anything too much to add. Alan and Megan, you did a great job covering everything, and even speaking to our part of the state over here. We are the driest right now in the southern portion of the valley, like Alan said, and up closer to the international border, they have seen closer to that normal or slightly above normal winter precipitation, but overall pretty dry for the southern half of the basin. And that northeast corner of the state, especially the Devil's Lake Basin area, has seen some decent precipitation, so not as dry. But overall, with drier conditions probably expected throughout the summer, like Megan has said and Ellen has said, looking at those drought categories expanding and increasing probably as we go through the upcoming months. So something to keep an eye on. No flooding concerns at this time. What little snow is still out there from our last event this last weekend, won't have much of an impact on anything. We've seen very minimal river rises so far this spring, so let's hopefully it stays that way. That's all I have, unless there's any questions directed my way.
Awesome, Amanda. We really appreciate that. And again, asking for questions, just a reminder, you can put those in the questions box. We got a couple in there right now that we'll go ahead and answer here in a second. And again, if you want to raise your hand also, if you want to kind of ask it verbally, we can do that too. The first comment we have in there kind of harkens back to, I think, what Alan was talking about maybe about a half an hour or so ago when we were talking about Blizzard Hannah and sandbagging in the blizzards and how can we forget all that. And I think most folks would agree with that, Warren. I don't know if Alan's got anything else that he'd like to add there. I hear him kind of laughing in the background. It sounds like those are very memorable times for those that were here to experience it. Also a question from Amber. Sounds like she's asking if we can possibly give the PowerPoint slides out after this presentation. So I will let Megan talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so as soon as this is done, I will send out a PDF with all the slides. That way you can have it in case you're want the images or want the information in there. I'll also work on uploading the recording and send that out as well. That'll probably be a little bit just because it takes a while to process the video and get it uploaded on our YouTube. So look for the slides right after this and then a follow-up email with the recording.
Awesome, thank you for that, Megan. And again, for anybody that doesn't want to ask a question here, or maybe you think about something afterwards, again, feel free to jot down this slide. You know, the phone numbers there for Bismarck and Grand Forks, also the contact information for Megan, Alan, and Amanda that you're hearing here today. Also, again, Tyler's not speaking here today, but he's also a great contact over in the Grand Forks office for any of this type of information. So as we're kind of waiting here, one question that I guess I would ask a little bit from Alan's perspective, just kind of thinking back on the spring flood season and the fire weather season that we've had so far, has there been anything that's really stuck out to you at all? I mean, in regards to any of that, is there any areas that, maybe parts of the state that you're thinking right now are more potentially under the gun for the fire season, perhaps? I think we're starting to see, maybe the South at times kind of having a few more reports than maybe parts of the Northeast, for instance.
Yeah, I think it's pretty safe to say that the areas that we're most concerned about, if you are south and west of the Missouri River, okay, that's an area of concern. We've had fire starts out in that area. I think there was just one in McKenzie County today that was pretty small, but there have definitely been starts in that neck of the woods. They just haven't been real problematic yet. And then as you go east of the Missouri River, roughly the I-94 corridor in south, I think has a little bit more concern at this point, simply because I was driving and was up in the Harvey neck of the woods just a couple days ago, and there was a noticeable change. There was more moisture in the surface soils and everything that I saw up there. So I would, in particular, I-94 and south going east of Bismarck, anything west of and south of the Missouri River, those are the areas that I think are of most interest to us as far as fire concerns right now.
Awesome, thank you, Alan. And I guess I'm not seeing anything else here for questions yet or any hands raised. I'll just ask one quick one to Megan really fast here, not to put you on the spot, but I know everybody always wants to talk about winter, right? So I mean, just looking way out there, what are the challenges at this point to talk about what we might be thinking for next winter already? Are there any signs that you're hearing about in those discussions you were talking about that they're already talking about for potentially next winter? Anything that stood out there?
Yeah, and the seasonal forecasters are always looking really far into the future. They're always doing these outlooks for a year in advance, right? The big thing that they are always looking at for winter, regardless of what time of year it is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. This time of year is just well known to have problems in model guidance, so there's never a lot of confidence in what they're seeing for the ENSO models at this point. So even having equal chances for ENSO neutral or La Nina and low chances for an El Nino makes me think that we're probably going somewhere in that direction of either, just a neutral phase, which doesn't really help us from a seasonal outlook perspective, or the La Nina, which would favor the warm fall before a cooler than normal winter, which is what we saw this past winter. So that's what I'm always keeping an eye on, just because it's interesting and it is the biggest forecasting tool that we have. It's got the best predictability, but this time of year is always really tricky to look that far out to the winter season.
Awesome, thank you for that. And I'm not seeing any additional questions popping into the questions box or any hands raised. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap this up and just say thank you to everybody for attending today. Again, if you have any questions afterwards that you might think of, don't hesitate to reach out to Megan, Alan, Amanda, or Tyler. Again, you got the contact information there. So again, with no further questions, we'll let you go, and thank you again for attending.